do our best to communicate. So as you guys were coming in tonight, you're given a handout. And so if you would pull that out, and we're going to work through this passage tonight together and hopefully glean a little bit about Peter and to whom he's writing this letter. And so our passage is found in 1 Peter chapter 4, 1 through 6. And the study tonight is called, Who Are They? And so in your first blank on your paper there, you can write in Peter is the author of this letter. And one thing, just to give you a little bit of a picture of who Peter is, the way I picture Peter many times is I try to give him a character, because sometimes it's hard to grasp everything about a biblical character just by reading text alone. So how many people grew up with Nick at Night as part of your digest, what you took in? And there was a show on Nick at Night called Happy Days. How many people watched Happy Days? And you can sing the theme song and everything. And who is your favorite character on Happy Days? The Fonz, right? Fonzie. Why? Because he always brought the drama. He brought the excitement. He brought the beef, if you will, from the commercials back then. And he was somebody that was magnetic. He was charismatic. He drew people to him. And you saw that throughout the show. And so I see Peter in that light. He's the Fonzarelli of the 12 disciples. He keeps everybody entertained, and he goes out on a limb sometimes. Sometimes he sticks his foot in his mouth, And so we see several stages throughout Peter's life. We can take different pictures of moments where he probably said, hey, as he's sinking into the water. It's probably one of those moments after he got out of the boat. He's probably like, what is up with this? Another time is when Jesus calls him Satan. Literally, he says, get thee behind me, Satan, after Peter says, Lord, you don't have to die, right? So there's probably these moments where it's a little awkward, a little off kilter, and that's Peter. And that's what we understand of in the biblical narrative. That's who we see. And so Peter's the author of this letter, and he's writing to your next opening there, written to an audience of 5 churches. And so, just to give you a little bit of a context, a church back then wasn't like a church like where we're sitting tonight. A church would have been an area where there were a group of believers. And so these 5 churches were found in what is modern-day Turkey, in Asia Minor, in that area. And so these were, and how this letter would have been distributed would have been read to them, or maybe it was passed to them, depending on the size of the group, and they could read it for themselves if they were literate. And so you have to imagine that this is kind of a broadcast approach to sending out a message. And so let's read this together. And so I have 6 people over on this side. So let's start with Sophia and Olivia, and then work our way back. If you guys would read 1 Peter 4, 1 through 6, and we'll get started with our study.
Therefore, since Christ suffered in the body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin.
As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God.
Go ahead.
For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry.
They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you.
But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead.
For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit.
Now, the first time I read this in this translation, NIV, there's a lot of pronouns that maybe can get a little bit confusing on who Peter is talking about. And so our study tonight, as we work our way through this, we're going to identify together who these pronouns are referring to. So verse 1, we'll start at the top. It says, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. So who do you suppose that yourselves is referring to? The readers or the listeners? That's either one of those would be a good answer for that. And then he goes on to say, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. So who would the whoever be referring to?
Believers.
A believer or a devoted believer, someone who has given their life over. Either, but believer is definitely an adequate answer. Verse 2, as a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for human desires, but rather for the will of God. So, as a result, they, who is this referring to?
Not believers.
Actually, it is the believer himself. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives. So both of those blanks are referring to believers in verse number 2. Verse number 3 says, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. Now, who would you refer to in this? The reader, right? Now, there is some dispute as far as when I did a commentary study about who you really is. Some commentaries will tell you, or biblical historians would tell you, that there's a mix of Gentile and Jewish converts. But if you look at the list of transgressions here, it says living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. Now, to add detestable idolatry onto this list kind of narrows who he's really talking to. And so some commentaries, some biblical scholars would say that it's only written to Gentiles, that Peter's not really speaking to Jews. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and it kind of narrows who is qualified as far as who this is addressed to. So what I'd like to do is I want to ask you tonight, are these things that happen in our day and age? Is this list something that we deal with? Do you see living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, detestable idolatry? Do you see that on a daily basis? And so I suppose that this doesn't eliminate us from the discussion because we're surrounded by that, right? And so even though it may not specifically speak to us, like we've never dealt with idolatry, this passage still has some credence for us as readers. So let's move on. Verse 4 says, they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Now, they, there, and they all refer to the same group of people, and that is the pagans, right? So that's your next blank. And you, in this verse, refers to the believer or the reader, whichever way you want to. If the reader is a true believer, it refers to them. Verse 5, but they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Now, who's they in the 5th verse? The pagans, right? And who is him? Who does the judging? That's God, right? And so that gives us kind of an outlet, kind of a way to say, you know what, even though they're judging or they're heaping abuse upon believers, there will be retribution, right? There's an outlet, there's a funnel for which this judgment's going to go. So verse number 6, for this is the reason the gospel is preached, even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. Now, this last verse is contested throughout every commentary that I've looked at. There are 4 different views, and so what I want to do is I want to lay out these views for you and let you choose which you think is the correct one, because they're all accepted. One view is that Jesus, when he died, he went and preached to the people who had already passed away. One view is that he preached to everyone, gave them a second chance, a do-over. That's one view. Another view is similar to that one, that Jesus in his 3-day death went to Hades, hell, and preached the gospel to the honorable or just people from the past. And so the people who were really good but couldn't live up to the law and died and went to hell, they got a second chance. The third view is that the word dead in the Greek here is referring to not literally dead, but spiritually dead. And that the apostles were, or the teachers who are preaching today are preaching to the spiritually dead, and then they'll be judged and found alive in God. That's the third view. The fourth view, which is the view that I personally take, is that he's referring to in this letter the people who were Christians, who are believers, but who have now passed on. And so that's the fourth view. So you can choose whether you think it's the dead in general, the dead who were good, spiritually dead, or believers who are now deceased. So earlier, I want to tie this together because I feel like Peter's really speaking, and his message can be tied into a simple concept. And that is this, that many times we take a picture of an individual or a character, like I implied earlier in our study of Peter. We made a generalization, hey, he's the Fonz, that's who he is. The beginning of 1 Peter, he doesn't say the disciple Peter, he says an apostle of Jesus Christ, Peter, right? And so there was a transition in who Peter was. There was a turnaround. And he stopped, and I believe if we look at through the whole of Scripture, when Jesus sat him down and restored him and said, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, there was a turn in who Peter was. And it was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost when he was filled with the Spirit. And from that moment on in Acts, the Peter that we see is no longer the bumbling and stumbling Fonz, but now he's the apostle. He's changed. He's been reborn, and there's something different about him. As a matter of fact, at the council, when he's testifying why he healed the man, they said, I could tell, it was clear that these men had been with Jesus. There's just something about him. And so I want to ask you tonight, if you'll flip your page over to the other side, there are three things that I'm going to ask you to do tonight before you lay your head on your pillow. And I want you to go through this, and I'll touch on why I want you to do this. The first thing is the will of God is mentioned in verse 2. So I want to ask you, where are you going? What's the will of God for your life? The second thing is you have spent enough time in the past doing blank. So I want to ask you, what is God, or what it maybe is Peter asking you in this passage for you to leave behind? And the third thing is they heap abuse on you, verse 4, implying that it's going to cost you something. This following Jesus and leaving something behind and doing the will of God, it's going to cost you something. And so, if you would, think tonight, what is it going to cost me? And so I pray that this passage became real to you tonight, and that you can see what Peter was truly trying to communicate to the listeners. Thank you.
All right.